I'm Balamurugan, and I'll be presenting my AI labor stress test. AI-driven displacement is expected to arrive at a staggering pace and scale, with Goldman Sachs projecting 15 million workers displaced in the US alone over the next decade. Being displaced can cut a worker's earnings by as much as 25%, a gap that persists even half a decade later. And the cost isn't just to their wallets, but to their bodies too, as the stress of the layoff and the chronic strain of earnings losses can cost a mid-career worker 1.5 years of life expectancy, which is nearly 5 times what air pollution costs the average American. What makes the AI wave especially problematic is that past technological waves ran on creative destruction, where, for example, the carrot shop worker displaced by the automobile could take a job on the assembly line that built it. However, that doesn't quite hold with AI, because the secretary it displaces is unlikely to be the AI engineer the firm hires next. Therefore, even a net gain in employment can coexist with the economic disempowerment of displaced workers. And left unchecked, that process hardens into a durable underclass that's helpless to work its way out. While we can't prevent AI-driven displacement entirely, we can identify which workers are most vulnerable and how we can most effectively help them. To answer those questions, I started with the Anthropic Economic Index, which reports the extent to which AI is observed automating individual tasks. I then developed a formula that converts task-level automation into occupational displacement, and it predicts 14.9 million US jobs in the path of displacement, which lands right where Goldman Sachs did. Labor markets, however, are organized regionally. To obtain the number of displaced workers per occupation within each labor market, I developed an approximation that takes the coarse reporting areas the government publishes down to the county level and rebuilds them into the 594 commuting zones that define local labor markets. Then, to compare those displaced workers against the openings available to them, I distributed national job openings across those commuting zones based on occupational presence. This gives us job displacement and job openings in the same zones, and to connect the two, I developed an equation for how traits like skills, education, and wages shape where a displaced worker lands, and I calibrated it against over 11,000 moves made by real displaced workers. This gave me a routing probability for every occupation-to-occupation transition, which I then used to route displaced workers to openings accordingly. Once routed, displaced workers compete for openings, and the number left without a job is what I use to calculate a pressure score for over 300,000 occupation-by-commuting zone pairs covering over 154 million American workers. Ranking them on a standardized scale provides a triage layer, the answer to whom and where to prioritize for displacement assistance. This is a substantial improvement over the existing standard, as it has wider geographic and occupational coverage while predicting reemployment outcomes better. That lets it designate vulnerable occupations for the assistance programs every level of government is currently reaching for. And with the whom and where settled, what remains is how to help the vulnerable workers we've identified. The government offers retraining funds for displaced workers, and those funds can only be used to train toward a list of in-demand occupations per region. But currently, every worker in a labor market gets the same list, which misses the fact that the ideal set of occupations to train toward varies by worker. This is where the routing matrix comes in a second time, as it can map out feasible transition routes per occupation, and evidence shows that tailoring training this way can produce earnings gains as high as 34%. Now, to make my findings more digestible, I built an interactive tool where you can read labor pressure across commuting zones and see the most and least stress occupations in any one of them. You can also follow a single occupation across the country or compare it against every other. You can even turn the dial on how fast AI-driven displacement arrives, and it changes which occupations are deemed most vulnerable. Now, for next steps, I spoke with the vice president at Lightcast, a proprietary data vendor, who offered me a 50% reduction based on the promise of this project. I also applied for a 9.3K Blue Dot Impact Grant, for which I was invited to an interview this upcoming week. Lastly, I've been selected to receive mentorship from a PhD economist through Effective Thesis, and I'll be working to further calibrate my instrument using Lightcast data while also exploring a randomized control trial to evaluate the worker-level impacts of my instrument's recommendations. And that brings an end to my AI labor stress test presentation. Thank you for listening.